As I mentioned in the first of the series, I see this as a continuum. The first one focused on science. What is wildlife science and what's not wildlife science? Because it's become very confusing now with the, people going to parks or going to zoos or having wild animals as pets or whatever. So it's all got very muddied as to what is wildlife. So what is wildlife science was the first theme and discussion, where I had probably the best two of my proteges I have encouraged over the years, Dr. Samba Kumar and Dr. Arjun Gopalaswamy. And the second one focused more on the structure and framework of what is conservation. It's often again mistaken for being kind to animals or thinking tigers are cute and all those things. It's not. It's like medicine and agriculture and applied science. You use the first part, the wildlife biology and ecology, apply it to solving problems. So conservation takes it beyond the science part, because much of the conservation problems are actually consequences of human actions. So it is human beings that need to be managed so that wildlife can survive. So conservation has a large element of that. I did cover definitions and general principles, although some bit of history comes. So this talk, if you have come to both, there will be slight overlap. Some of the pictures will be familiar and some of the stuff is same. But I am rooting this much more strongly in my own experience and journey. So whatever I spoke in the other two talks will be in a little more detail. And also in this, I'll go beyond conservation a little bit as to what else has to work properly if conservation has to function. After all, conservation is one human endeavor, just like health, care, human rights, whatever. So it needs to function in a wider system. So again, this I went through in both, because wildlife conservation, what is it? It involves three things. And the first one is, what is wildlife? Wildlife is free-ranging, terrestrial vertebrates, animals with vertebra, which are wild, which are not artificially fed and watered and clothed, like pet dogs are sometimes. And they're terrestrial. Marine systems are not defined as wildlife. Inland water species, vertebrates are, but not the deep sea ocean stuff. So there's a very definite scientific definition of wildlife. And conservation also has three elements which is often forgotten. Protecting, recovering threatened species is readily recognized, but harvesting species for use is very much a part of conservation also. Although not relevant for India, it is to some degree. If you look at inland fisheries, people do harvest wildlife. But in many other continents, many other contexts, species are harvested and used. So that becomes a part. The third one is, and the consumption part has two components. Either you actually physically directly consume the wildlife, or you non-consumptively use it, as in the case of wildlife tourism or something like that. Then there is a set of species that become dangerous to human society, or they become dangerous to other native species. So sometimes you have to eliminate species also as a part of wildlife conservation. And all this, as you can readily appreciate, it links to numbers of animals and how those numbers are changing. That is quite at the root of wildlife science. And it is not this. It is not about right of an individual tiger to live. Or it's not about of course, you have to be kind to animals, but this field is not about kindness to individuals or their rights. And it excludes domestic species. Because 10, 15,000 years ago, we domesticated 10 or 15 species, and they outnumber anything out wild. So if you have a one animal, one vote principle, wildlife will be wiped out, because there are so many domestic animals. And wild species held in captivity are also not typically a part of wildlife conservation. Although if they are augmenting conservation in the field, then you can consider it. But typically for exhibition, menageries, entertainment shows, if you have some wild animal, it's not conservation. I just wanted to go over that. So conservation is about saving pieces of nature, functioning pieces of wildlife and its habitat. That's really what it boils down to. It preserves all the processes, pollination, energy flows, seed dispersal. This is the lion-tailed macaque, which is one of the world's rarest monkeys, found only in the Western Ghats. So it's not just having this monkey in a cage, it's all the systems, its dependencies and interconnectedness. Saving that whole thing as a system is the goal of wildlife conservation. And today we also realize that human survival, or at least human subsistence, human agriculture, a lot of it depends on this biological basis, the biophysical world. Certain cycles play out, chemical cycles, biological cycles, carbon, all these things. So there is an ecosystem basis. The habitats of wildlife have a role. For example, water is a very obvious example, watersheds and how we dependent we are, and we realize that now. But they're all linked in some sense. The ecosystem services are often provided by wildlife habitats. That's why there is consensus. There wasn't much consensus on conservation till the 70s, 80s. Many of the newly liberated revolutionary countries basically said we don't want conservation. Both the communist parties of India said all forests and wasteland should be cleared and cultivated. Now every country in the world agrees that conservation is necessary for human survival. That consensus is there. How we go about it, there are lots of different arguments about it. And India is very fortunate in this sense because of the movement of continental plates and our geologic history, and more recently our position on the globe and the climate change over millennia. We have an incredible biodiversity. We have only 2% of the Earth's land area, but we have 13% of the world's birds, 7% of the world's mammals, and of these, 24% of the world's carnivore species occur on 2% of the land. We have, and this has nothing to do with we Indians or anything. Human beings came 70,000 years ago. It goes way back before that. And this, the other interesting thing is we have faunal elements from across the world. Although we don't call them by that, we have grizzly bears and we have the elk in India, in Kashmir and in the Himalayas. And we have African elements. We had lions were common across North India at one point, although only one population. It's a species of African origin. Leopards are of African origin, hyenas. So we do have, and we do have typical Asian species like the Asian rhinos, the tiger and the dhole and other species. So it's a unique heritage we have. And how do we go about saving this? There are multiple approaches. You can make a vegetation map and earmark based on biogeography. You can have indices of species diversity. Multiple approaches are there. And one of them is a species-centered approach. It's not the only one. But that's the one I'm going to talk about it, not because it's the only one, but it's one of the most powerful and practically useful one which has demonstrated success. So you typically pick a species that is at the top of the food chain, or it is very, it demands large tracts of land to sustain its populations, or it occurs in diverse habitats, so capturing all the diversity. So what you are doing is using the species, this charismatic species, like an umbrella to save a lot of other things. Whereas if you start trying to save the let's say a snail or something, you don't need 600 square kilometers or 1,000 square kilometers. With a tiger you can, but with that you can get a lot of other things protected. And it's not just the tiger, you have to be careful, like in the Himalayas it could be the snow leopard, it could be in the Rajasthan deserts, it could be the great Indian bustard or the wolf. So if you pick these species carefully, these umbrella species, a lot of biodiversity can be conserved, and tiger is one of those. Tigers, in fact, if you look at their, at one time they were found across 30 different countries, and their range in the last 200 years has shrunk to 7% of what it was just 200 years ago. They were found from Armenia to Bali, from Iraq to Vladivostok, but they now occupy only 7% of that area. But the reason why some of these species work is some of our scientific arguments, like their position in the ecological pyramid or food chain, some of it is cultural, because we have had this wild connect in all cultures, and the tiger is a very good example of that. Not only one, but tiger is a very good example. In that picture, we have the tiger dance or Hulivesha in Mangalore. That is a Huliappa temple in Uttara Kannada. This one is a Gond tribal worship. So this creates an interest. When you want to conserve something that has a psychological connection to society, it makes people act. So it's an effective tool, so to speak, in addition to the scientific arguments. For example, tiger was found in Asia. It was never a European species. Alexander's general, Seleucus Nictor, took the first tiger, I think it was in 200 BC or around that time, just after Alexander. That was the first tiger shown to the West. But within a short span, the animals captured the world's imagination. So when the new world was found by Spaniards, they saw the jaguar there and called it the tiger. So that's kind of the background. But my interest, what I will do in this talk is, first I'll talk about the science of tigers as it fascinated me as I got involved in it from 1965 when I was a second-year engineering student. So it's some kind of something that has driven me. And this happened because a great scientist called George Schaller came and studied tigers in Ghana in 1962, and his landmark publication really inspired me to follow in his path. So the tiger and other big cats are unique in the sense that they are obligate meat-eating species that are evolved to catch things much bigger than themselves. A tiger or a lion or any of these big cats can take down prey that's 3 to 4 times their size, which is not common among mammalian predators. And in the case of the tiger, the principal prey in the landscapes that I started working in Nagarhole, then expanded to all of the Malenad landscape, then some other sites in India, then Thailand and some other places. But basically these are the principal prey of the tiger: the cheetal, sambar, barking deer, pig and gaur. So the first step for me was, since tiger is at the next level of the food chain, the tiger eats this other stuff. But we had at that point in time in 1986 no knowledge of how much prey was there. It was not a part of our scientific training or administrative training to do these things. So I had to borrow virtually all these methods from the West and apply them for the first time in India. This is a method called line transect sampling, using which you count prey animals. It works for species that you can see readily and detect. It doesn't work for nocturnal species. There are other methods, but this works well for the tiger's prey. You walk in a line, you count the animals you see, but you also measure that distance, perpendicular distance. You do that by measuring one angle and a radial distance using a rangefinder. With this data, you can accurately estimate the numbers of prey animals. It requires a lot of preparation. There are whole teams preparing these transects, which are very narrow lines which are there just to guide you. They're not there to kind of, but of course now when the government does it, they cut a wide swath and lots of people go talking on that line. Of course, that's not the way to do it. But the way to do it is to really sneak on animals. And if you are not skilled, it can be quite dangerous, but if you are skilled, it really opens your eyes to what's inside the forest. It's a very different view from the view from a gypsy or a car. So while I was doing this, I had a lot of young naturalists come and visit me. Some of them got interested, so I started training them also. Because all this required was good natural history skills and ability to read some instruments, and some of the younger forest department people. So I was able to collect a lot of data using volunteers. This was my recruiting tool. So this was way back in 19s. The work involved collecting kills made by predators, measuring structure of the habitat where a tiger has hunted something, to assemble their whole predatory behavior. And that is Dr. George Schaller measuring a dead gaur with me in 1991. So, for most people, they hold their noses, they don't come when I'm doing my field work. But for field biologists, these rotting carcasses and stinking droppings of animals are the gold mine. That's what we seek in life. So having understood the prey base and general patterns of predation, next step was to understand social behavior of tigers. How do they share land? How do they raise their cubs? How do generations control territories? This type of, how do they communicate even? And for this, you need, I was the first person to use telemetry on tigers in India. The technique was developed only in the 60s, mid-60s, and it was applied for the first time on tigers by Malthusian, who was my professor in Florida. And we started using it in 1989 in India. But what we did was, see, science is not purely Eastern or Western. Science pulls the best stuff from all. So what we did was, how do you catch a tiger? In Russia, they put snares. There's nothing else. They put a bait, a snare, and tiger gets caught in a wire snare. You can't do that in India. We have wild elephants, we have other tigers. It's very risky for the tiger. In some other places where tigers don't have too much food, they enter traps and they get trapped. That's a good way to catch them. It's a very safe way. But in these where prey is plentiful, they don't enter traps. So we modified an ancient Nepalese and Indian hunting technique of conducting a beat using elephants. You put a bait out there, the tiger kills the bait, and after that, it's a buffalo bait, usually small buffalo, and you go on elephant back and the beaters kind of push the tiger. They don't chase it like in a normal old British shikar. And before this goes on, a white cloth is strung and a kind of a corral constructed around the tiger. So it's being pushed and I am just 3 meters off with a dart gun, no gun, nothing. It was the only moment when I was at some real risk. The tiger would quietly try to sneak under me because that's where the path is open, it doesn't see. And it works on the native genius who spotted that white cloth is a psychological barrier for tigers. They don't jump it. So that's how we used to dart the tigers. And once they're down, there's a process. You have to be trained. Fortunately, I had a very good teacher, Malthusian, so I learned it well. And then once the tiger has a collar, this was VHF collars. You had to be physically on ground or from an aircraft. We didn't have aircraft, we used ground tracking. Now, of course, there are GPS collars, satellite collars, and people don't even go to the field. They're at home sitting in front of a computer. But you miss so much when you don't have this VHF data in addition to the great spatial data from satellites. So when you go out and track them, you start learning how do they communicate. Half a dozen tigers will live in an area as big as Greater Bangalore. How do they even find each other? They have no email, no telephone, nothing. How do they find each other? They have an elaborate chemical communication system. They spray scent and they roar, and these two mechanisms, and they have digital pads leaving scent. So they have an elaborate social system that functions, and they can meet when they want to meet. Mother and cubs can keep in track, but otherwise they live separately. It's a very complicated system. Tigers, leopards, they all have this. And I was able to literally live with them, track them, and see some of these things. So this is an example of what a tiger is really like, what a powerful predator it is, and why we should not think of it as a cute, cuddly animal that our kids should go and hug. It's a, you saw them hunt. It's a very skilled task. One of my radio collared tigers actually died while trying to take down a gaur. But it's a very, it's the biggest ratio you see between a big cat and a prey. The big gaur weigh about a ton and the tiger is about 200, 250 kilos. So it shows how powerful they are, but it's also a strong lesson that we should not romanticize them and say they should be wandering around in villages while children are going to school. Not a good idea. And the empathy for the tiger taking that direction can actually backfire on conservation, and I've seen that repeatedly. I've been on so many of these tragic incidents where urban animal lovers have prevented killing of man-eating tigers. So I just wanted to show that, to show it's a beautiful animal, but it's not something you want in your backyard. The other thing that telemetry gave me was the spatial arrangement. For example, the range, this is the range of a tigress called Sundari, who was, which is just about 20 square kilometers. I tracked her for 6 years. My wife, who's sitting here, was very jealous when I was not coming home and doing this. So, but basically, this is a function of prey density. That was the idea. How does a big cat like that manage to live in 20 square kilometers? In Russia, the range is 600 square kilometers for the same animal, same food requirements. And that is a mystery we cracked later, but that was the system. There are females which have territories. There may be about 25 females in Nagarhole with adjacent territories. The males have mating rights over those 4 or 5 females. The dominant males monopolize mating with 4 or 5 females or 3 females. And then there are the 2-year-old plus animals, male and female, which are floating around trying to find territories to settle down. These had ranges of, these 2 young males had ranges of 50 square kilometer, 80 square kilometer each. And there was a dominant male who was in the process of dying after being injured in a fight, and his range shrank to 20, 30 square kilometer, then he died. So you get this data, this kind of fine-grained data by tracking these animals over multiple years. Sorry, I need to go back up. Around this time, while I was getting deep into tiger society, there was a problem. The Chinese economy has prospered under dong shopping, and the demand for tiger body parts and all wildlife products had shot up, and that wave of poaching was hitting India. In fact, some of the tigers in Ranthambore, Kana, and even 1 or 2 in Nagarhole were trapped by native poachers for the trade. So I was a little concerned that while I understood tiger biology at depth, what was going to happen to the populations. So I decided to change my study from study of tiger society to study of numbers, which is a much tougher problem. How many tigers there are? How are the numbers changing? So unfortunately, because we don't have a scientific basis for our forestry, wildlife management, it never had, unfortunately. So they had invented their own method of counting tigers from tracks called the pug mark census, and it was followed like a religion from 1968. And the numbers they were generating kept going up, but it didn't have any relationship to real tiger numbers. So I had critiqued it and become very unpopular as a youngster, criticizing all the senior graybeards who are following this method. But I also had a responsibility to develop a new method, and luckily at that time, cheap camera traps came into the market. These are cheap cameras that were triggered by electronic or other kinds of triggering devices. So I started working with them in Nagarhole in 1991. So the initial camera trapping movement from pug mark to camera trapping, because I found the pug mark didn't work. There wasn't enough information to distinguish individuals. But with the camera photo, the stripe patterns, there is so much statistical information in the stripe, it's just like a fingerprint. You can ID them, and no two tigers are alike. In fact, two flanks of the tiger are completely different. So we developed some of the stuff in Nagarhole, and the methodology kind of was useful, and very quickly it got picked up worldwide by leopard biologists, cheetah biologists. Various other people found this worked, and they adopted camera traps as a standard method, except in my own country. The Wildlife Institute of India scientists held a meeting and said this won't work in India. But I said I'll keep trying anyway. So we had numbers for these individual animals, and we tracked them over time. Once we published the results from Nagarhole, I was very keen to take it across. And tigers live in very different habitats. A method may not work somewhere else. So I chose a number of sites, couple in central India, Kanha and Pench, then Ranthambore in western India, Sundarban swamps, Namdapha rainforest. So it was a 10-year project where we went around doing this study in multiple habitats, and it worked fine everywhere. And what it brought out was typically, it corroborated the data I had from telemetry. A tiger typically kills once a week a deer-sized animal, eats it for 2-3 days, then goes around and makes the next kill in 8 to 10 days. That's how they live. So that means it has to eat 50 deer per year, which means that is the interest income or dividend for a retired person. What is the capital to generate that 50 year? It's 500. That is, for one survival tiger to survive, you need 500 prey animals. And this we could finally test, because I had data both on tiger numbers and prey numbers. And this shows that pyramid, And we did, when we found the results, it was so interesting that this one tiger to 500 prey model held across the board. But we could spot some places. There was Pench, Madhya Pradesh, where a lot of tigers had been poached. So the prey base was higher than the tiger numbers that could be there. And on the other hand, another site called Melghat had more tigers than the prey base supported, because they were eating a lot of cattle. But this equation holds very well in a natural system. And then we started building up a cadre of scientists who were involved in this work, and we expanded the work in Karnataka across, not from Nagarhole, all the way to all the other parks, about 6,000 square kilometers from Kali Tiger Reserve to Kaveri in the south. But Nagarhole was the origin. It was a very disciplined team of people with the resources. There were 3 PhD scientists, whatever. It is serious. It can't be done with illiterate fieldmen, trackers. It does need top-level science. But the field assistants can be native trackers. It also required other structures, infrastructure. Most of them were old forest lodges and things. And at the end of it, we really had monitored, starting from, this shows data from 2004. We were showing the density of all the prey. And you see how clearly the older parks, Nagarhole and Pandipur, with more protection, have much higher prey densities. Because it takes a long time to recover prey. It's not a process you should artificially inflate by bringing prey, giving them water, giving them food. This is a natural recovery. You see the park, the bottom is Kali. All of these are good habitats. Eventually, 20, 30 years, you get to the top. So this prey density would mean it would also have high tiger densities. And that's exactly what we found. Over time, from the beginning, we identified 1,000 tigers in camera traps. They are not all alive at the same time, but over time we were able to individually capture 1,000 tigers. And the data also showed tiger densities. Again, red is Nagarhole, green is Bandipur. You see they have very high densities. This is tiger numbers actually. The density multiplied by the area, and they are way above the other two parks. And this is so. This is the kind of data you need if you have to do scientific conservation. You can't do it based on storytelling. We also were able to, from camera, monitor dispersals. Dispersals across long distances. One of the tigers born in Bhadra moved all the way to Kali. Another one, which was a young male we caught in Bandipur, was found near Shikaripur. So they were still using the landscape. So the connectivity issues came that you had to look at this population as a meta-population, many sources and sinks, but animals are moving between them. And one of the most interesting things in this long-term study, this is a long-term capture-recapture study, was this is Nagarhole population. It's a healthy population that's in good shape, high density, high reproduction, but still it is losing 23% of its animals every year. That's their high mortality rate. This is natural to tigers because the reproduction is very high also. Every female produces 15 cubs in her lifetime. So that is natural, there is nothing to worry about. Then there are other things, what proportion migrate and all those statistical things, but the densities, the most important thing is this column. The densities vary between 7 and, that's an odd number, 21, but typically it's more like 7 to 15. There is this bounce because number of females producing cubs varies from year to year. It's not spaced regularly, like 20 females may breed 1 year, only 5 in the next year. That causes this bounce. So with 25% annual mortalities and this bounce, if you don't do this kind of scientific camera trapping every year, putting cameras is virtually a waste of time. Unfortunately, that's what happens. The official census is done once in 4 years. 25% of the animals are dying every year, so there's no continuity in the data. And you are missing these bounces, so you don't know what you are reporting. You are reporting some numbers and papers are happy with those numbers. So as we looked at the meta-population, we started looking at this whole area and tried to see. One of the problems is, one issue is you can monitor these source populations accurately using strong methods. But these are not methods you can apply across large landscapes. They are time intensive, money intensive, camera intensive. So if you can just look for tracks and do kind of easy to do surveys, then you cannot get numbers, but you can tell where tigers are, where populations are getting established, where they are going extinct. So it's kind of called occupancy modeling. Another, again, the basic model was developed under this project by my collaborator James Nichols. And it involved simple things, people going to the field and looking for animal signs rather than all these high-tech techniques I talked about. But the interesting thing is the result. Almost all surveys done of most mammals at that stage in India use this data. This is, you find animal sign, you don't find. If you find, it's present. If you don't find, it's absent. This is completely wrong because it misses the issue. If you are there but you don't see it, you didn't detect it in that sample, you are underestimating occupancy. And that is exactly what happened. All the occupancy surveys were underestimating, and when we use repeated visits to estimate the probability of missing animals, then we were able to correct for the deficiency in the data. Even to this day, they don't use this technique. Although it's developed, used widely globally, they're still using a simple linear regression that was borrowed from agricultural statistics. So at this point in time, standing on the base of science, I grew up in Puttur. I saw tigers go nearly extinct, and my interest was conservation too. So we started to, this was in the early 90s, there was very little resources in the forest department, so we launched a project which involved building capacity of the foresters, because law enforcement is really critical, and also supported the government, giving about 28 jeeps, and those days the governments were also very happy to receive this support. Now they have a lot of money, they don't need the money, but those days these resources were very critical. That was Mr. D. Manjunath, who was forest minister at that time. Then this knowledge, whatever learned, we freely shared. It's a public project. Today, no data of Project Tiger is available for any scientist or anybody to see. It's locked up in Delhi. Results are given out. We put everything out in public domain, 150 publications, and shared it. This is the Project Tiger team visiting our office. Wildlife Institute of India was the training hub, so that's Dr. Nichols, my other collaborator, who's kind of a world-class statistical ecologist. We held a special course with him and David Anderson and others to pass on these methods. People do come to these, but nothing takes root in the government systems because it's not driven by passion. So, stretching beyond that, looking at the big picture, India is has 4 times more people than US, or 5 times, I guess now, but we are only 1/3 the size. We have poverty, we have land-based occupations, wood was the source of energy, and this is why we have so little forest left. If you look at all of India, only about 10% is under reasonable forest cover. All that green is natural, but what you see in the top right is what you have. And that's the picture of Western Ghats. And so the key thing is, only about 3% of this 4% of our land is under protected areas. So when people say, why do you need space for wildlife, we are a poor country, I'm talking about 4%. So for all this biodiversity. So the protected areas became central, and the British had created a land base of reserve forest, but there were no strict protected areas. Hunting was rampant, and agricultural expansion was rampant. Although forest reservation put some boundaries on it, still a lot of land was being encroached, and the land was not encroached also, the forests were getting degraded by the huge number of livestock. I just want to go back to one statistic I like repeating, because people don't get how dominant we are in the mammalian biomass. When 3 lakh years ago, when humans evolved, we occupied 3% of the world's biomass. Rest were all wild animals. That's the total weight of animals. When we invented agriculture and had all our domestic animals up about 10,000 years ago, we and our animals were 30 and the wild was still 70. Now it's 97 domestic animals and humans and 3% wild. So that corroborates this shrinkage of the habitat also. So these pressures need to be taken off. There is no way you can extract more from these remnants, and there is a myth that you can take forest products and make a living and people can live at high densities. Without going into it, at the densities we have, it's impossible. And there are many rural uses of the land that are destructive, like fires, cattle grazing, extraction of wood, both by the government and local people. Many minor forest products like tendu leaves or whatever used to be used locally, now they have linked to global markets, urban markets, and bottomless markets. So there is no way you can extract more from these people as a model for conserving them. We also had this history of, particularly after steel, gunpowder, all that came about 400 years ago, massive killing of predators took place because they were dangerous to crops, dangerous to who, and they also had a prestige value. So the Maharajas, colonials massively hunted. Between 1875 and 1925, probably about 75,000 were killed in India for sport and for bounties. Poor people were paid bounties to kill tigers. 100 rupees for a tiger was the bounty. So the other pressure was local people hunting for protein. Because we didn't have advanced farming, agriculture, people depended on animal protein, and meeting protein needs of a country like this wiped out for many areas. You see in tribal areas of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, you see the forest, but there's nothing underneath because the animals have been consumed. And with the addition of after World War II, with the arrival of the jeeps, the dry cell batteries, the hunting even became more rampant. So when I was in school, I thought I will never see a wild tiger. Everything was being wiped out. On top of it, there was commercial trade in valuable species, like elephants. This is a tiger jaw trapped for the bone trade, but elephant ivory. So all this was on the verge of wiping out wildlife in India, meeting commercial needs and local needs. That is when Mrs. Gandhi came to power, and she had a lot of interest in wildlife. She listened to conservationists. She was the first prime minister who listened. She brought strong laws. But unlike other Asian countries, we also had a very strong forest department with enforcement capabilities. So the first 30 years, foresters did a fantastic job of protecting these new reserves, and that's when wildlife started coming back. It happened to be the time that I got out of college and I became a biologist. When I got out of college, animals were almost gone in 1971. But after that, in the next 20 years, wildlife came back, not everywhere, in the small 3-4% area or 1% area. Prey populations came back. Within a decade or two, predator populations came back, and we started watching tigers. Even tourists now can go and see tigers in Nagarhole and Bandipur. I had to wait 15 years to see my wild tigers. So on top of it, we are a developing country. We are developing irrigation dams, food production systems, which are all necessary, and they were impinging on these protected areas also. As we industrialized mining, coal, as we switched from wood to coal for fuel, so all these started putting pressures, and I started engaging with young people interested in conservation, and among them picked up some who became scientists and others who stayed in their professions but became very active in effective conservation. A lot of people wear wildlife t-shirts and run around Vidhan Saudha. That's not conservation. It's really engaging 20, 30 years, filing court cases, getting into trouble. That's what it is. And one other problem was within the protected areas also, there are landless people who are living inside the forest. And with the protected area loss, the wildlife coming back, they can't do agriculture. So their life is miserable, but they're also socially not empowered. So they are stuck in that situation. So there were a lot of people saying you should stay there and get 5 acres of land per family, electricity, factories, whatever. But then the park would vanish. So we started working on them, asking, what do you need? Because we worked with these people in the field, and everybody said they want land, they want employment, they want hospitals, education. So we started working with the government, local religious leaders, the communities directly, bypassing all the middlemen, and started convincing them to move out. This is an interview with a boy called Rajappa, whose father was my tracker. I have seen him as a teenager, and he was a very militant activist who wanted to stay there, wanted a hospital, wanted the road as a teenager. He used to come and badger me. But over time, he came over, and he's now leading the movement outside.
Rajappa of the Jenu Kuruba tribe moved out of the forest a few years ago. He is now a strong votary of fair relocation.
ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ಸರ್. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ನಾವು ಕಾಡಲ್ಲಿ ಜನ ಕಾಡಲೇ ಉಳಿಬೇಕಂತೇನೋ ಇದಿಲ್ಲಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ನಾಗರಿಕತೆ ಬರಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಬಂದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳಲ್ಲಿ ವಿದ್ಯಾಭ್ಯಾಸ ಕಲಿಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಕೂಡ ಮನೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಹಾಕುವಂಥ ಬಟ್ಟೆಗಳು ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಕೂಡ ಪಟ್ಟಣ ವಾತಾವರಣ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಈಗ ನಾವು ಬರೀ ಕಾಡಲ್ಲೇ ಇದ್ಕೊಂಡಾಗ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಕಾಣುತ್ತಾರೆ, ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಾಣಿಗಳ ಥರ ಕಾಣುತ್ತೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಬರೋದು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು. ಈಗ ನಾಗರಿಕತೆ ಅಂಟ್ಕೊಂಡೇ ಇರಬೇಕು, ನಾವು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದ ಮಾತ್ರಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಯನ್ನು ಉಳಿಸೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಆಚಾರ ವಿಚಾರ ನಡೆಸ್ತೀವಿ, ಹಬ್ಬ ಹುಣ್ಣಿಮೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಅದ್ರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ನಾವು ನಾಗರಿಕತೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು ತಪ್ಪು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಕಲ್ಪನೆ ಯಾರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಕಲ್ಪನೆ ತಪ್ಪು. ನಮ್ಮ ನಾಗರಿಕತೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು.
So this spread started in Nagarhole, but Bhadra was another case. next, just before you go to Bhadravati, you see it on the left side. Two visionary foresters, Mr. Shamsundar and Mr. Parmeshwarappa, had reserved a large tract of land for potential resettlement in Bhadra, and they had resisted pressure to give it to other people who wanted the land. So the land was there, and after about 10 years of very persistent effort by local conservationists, we were able to convince them to move out. And luckily for us, a very good DC and a very good DFO came. So within 3 years, more than 450 families moved out, and they are the most prosperous community now. The entire park got emptied in 3 years. And when Mr. Jairam Ramesh became Minister for Environment, I knew him slightly. He said, let's go see some tigers. I said, no, this is what you should see. So he took a chopper and flew there. And it blew his mind, and he kind of made it mainstream policy of the government to fully support relocation, which was, there wasn't the money. He did take interest in this to make this mainstream policy. But this is hard work. It's not that you just move them out. You keep in contact with them, you know about their welfare, you keep track of how they're doing, and act as their advocate with the government system. Government systems vary. Some individuals are good, some are rotten. So you have to be there to hold hand 10, 20 years till they become okay. My daughter Kriti did a longitudinal study of nutrition, healthcare, how they have prospered after moving. So we documented what this was. So nobody has gone back out of nearly 2,200 families that we were able to convince to move. Okay. So this area had 5 families with 500 cattle. This is in the middle of Kudremukh. And once they went, the area came back. So this was repeated. And in Kudremukh, we were even able to get interested NGO donors to privately fund relocation. So we simply looked for better land, showed it to these people, and typically about 20 kilometers away where what they want is already there, the hospital, school, employment, bus, whatever. And people happily moved and settled. And this model again for philanthropists who have crores and crores who are blowing up on all sorts of schemes, even today there are so many opportunities because the situation is very different now. Rural India is changing. People want to urbanize. You go to Hunsur, you will see a woman putting petrol in your car. This whole demographic transition, the economic kickstart that Mr. Narasimha Rao gave and the consequences are now people want to come out. People want to migrate. There are many things that people don't understand. In a rural society, there is stratification and oppression. Once you come to an urban area, that becomes much better in some sense. So there is that element, there is the material welfare element, education element. In COVID, these people just suffered. They completely lost out on schooling because you couldn't go to school and there's no internet there. So there's a tremendous opportunity to free up nature if the philanthropists are guided properly. Unfortunately, sadly, the government system has lost interest in this approach. There was no money when all this happened. There were limited funds. Now there are crores and crores of environmental monies offset. Supreme Court, the CAMPA, these are compensatory afforestation for industrial projects that have destroyed forests. They're collecting money. The impounded money was $70,000, 70,000 crores when it was released in 2010. Karnataka got 5,000 crores. Not 1 crore has gone for this vital task. People are willing to come, but government money gets spent in different ways that are more interesting and useful to people handling the money. It doesn't go to critical causes. Private philanthropists also not go do this because they're afraid of criticisms and what will people say, what will my image. So it's a sad case where there's a perfect situation for this. So we can expand beyond the protected areas. As I said, the protected areas are only 4% of the land. It's not much, but there is scope. There is tremendous scope to expand these areas. So the tigers are now, because of the faulty management policies, we have built these high-density tiger populations in some reserves. The rest of the habitat is empty. There's about 20% of the habitat in which there's high density of tigers, and the other 80 is empty because of this. And these high-density populations are actually, the conflict with the local people is aggravating. Livestock killing, retaliatory killing of tigers, and Kriti, under Center for Wildlife Studies, initiated a very innovative scheme to compensate people. The compensation money was there, but they were not getting it. So it was a system where they accessed government money, and it became very successful. You need to educate communities around the park where people are vulnerable to wildlife. So there are opportunities for all this, but the lack of science in management is proving to be a big problem. You will read every day in the papers about giving waters to leopard, digging bore wells in protected areas. We are turning our natural areas into domestic farms. Natural systems have to go through stress, animals have to die, they have to come back. That is how they have evolved. They are not domestic animals you have to feed and give water to. But unfortunately, this become the thing. And massive modification, creating of grasslands, big banks giving CSR money for creating grasslands inside protected areas, and removing exotics, a perennial task, they come back even stronger. So all this is leading to excessive densities of prey in few places. That's aggravating the conflict. Instead, if we had the natural recovery model that I showed earlier, gradually expanded it, it would work. The other pressure is coming from green energy. This whole quest for green energy, particularly these three forms, microhydels that are penetrating the most remote areas, wind farms that are going to remote areas, and solar. All these three are, because they are low density, low energy density sources, their footprint is vast on the land. And they are squeezing. Great Indian bustards are going extinct because of solar and wind power projects. Only less than 100 birds are left now. And these things are just taking over wildlands. So we have to rethink, and of course the traditional big projects, mines, they're also encroaching. They're putting a new highway system, which is necessary. You can go to Bangalore and Mysore now 1.5 hours. It's good. But we have only 3% parks. Instead of going around or going under or going over, there are engineering solutions which other countries have followed. We are cutting through these parks, and it's leading to, again, serious problems. Even tourism, which can be a powerful tool for conservation, because it creates a constituency. Nobody was interested in wildlife. Tourism played a role in creating that interest, but we are trashing the same old areas. There's not expanding into wider areas, not thinking innovatively. So these parks are getting trashed, and the obsession with tigers is killing interest in natural history. People go to tiger reserves, come back like they have come back from a funeral because they have not seen a tiger. So what do we need to do to change? I mean, these are some loose thoughts. I hope I'm okay with the time. One of the things is forests have been replaced by agriculture. That has been the main thing that has pushed back the forest frontier. If we keep expanding agriculture for food production, for commercial productions, natural habitats have to give way. So making agriculture efficient is critical. And I have seen this with the mechanization of transport, the livestock numbers have come. Now, the fertilizers, the green revolution played a role. What it did was it stopped the expansion for creating more food. It has its own deleterious effects, but the main thing it did was stop the expansion of agriculture into forest areas by producing more food. And the next step is genetic engineering, because green revolution also is now tapped out. There's enough watering and fertilizers you can do. Next step is to design plants, particularly given the climate change issues coming up. So we do need to move beyond traditional. The other thing is GDP, economics, everything is dependent on energy. Energy means base load energy. Imagine, Europe lost its forest in 1700 because people cooked with firewood. That was happening in India. They switched to coal. Then we are now switching to coal. All these are hydrocarbons buried centuries ago. We are drawing this capital. People shout about climate change. Climate change is a symptom. The disease is overshoot. We are exploiting a treasury of hydrocarbon energy that's buried there with these bad consequences and without replenishing it. So the real base load that is running aluminum factories, steel mills, not some Mickey Mouse thing on your rooftop, the industrialization, the railway transport systems, we do need base load energy which is now met by hydrocarbons. Nothing other than nuclear will replace it. That's the only one which is also solar energy, created 16 billion years ago, which can replace base load without occupying more land. Just one example, the entire set of reservoirs in Uttara Kannada that generate about 1200 megawatts of hydropower occupy 5,000 square kilometers of forest. Kaiga, single plant, occupies 6 square kilometers and generates as much energy. The footprint, energy efficiency, energy density of nuclear power is absolutely critical. If we expand the human footprint, we are going to wipe out a lot of places where nature can be saved. So this, I'm not very popular among conservationists who say we just have to live like our grandfathers or 500 years ago people did, all problems will go away. But if you analyze, that's not possible. It is possible, but not at the numbers we have. We have two problems. We have 8.5 billion people. It will stabilize at 10 billion people in 2050. And people want a better life. People don't want to have a life expectancy of 30 years, which is what India had when I was born. So if you have to meet these needs and yet save wild nature, some radical solutions are required. There are three big schools of thought in all this. The ones that completely reject modernity and say, go back to the past. I'm not going to talk much about it. I talked a bit in the last session. I can't get into everything. So I don't see it working. 10 billion people living the way their great-grandfathers did. Unless they drastically shrink their numbers and reduce their demand and starve to death. So the other school are the pure techno-optimists. I'm kind of there, but not all the way there. They say it does not matter. Technology will solve these problems. We keep growing. And this is something serious ecologists like Bill Rees and Holdren have pointed out. The field of economics never integrated with ecology. Their calculations are fine as long as you are exploiting these hydrocarbons which are underground or replace it with something else. So the overshoot, the climate change that we see is a symptom of this overshoot of the biophysical limits of the earth. Some of them have thought about how many people can live at a modest level like East Europeans do or something. Not like Donald Trump or some of our people with 100-story houses, etc. But it's about a billion and a half or something. Maybe 3 billion. But we are way up there. But the good thing is, one of the things is populations, with modernity and education, population comes down. One of the most phenomenal successes in family planning and population regulation is of all countries in the world, you would be surprised, it's Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came and they were having an 8-year war with Iraq, said reproduce, and population shot up. People were encouraged to have kids. Then a sensible economist told him, no, educate the women, publicize contraception, and Iran flipped. What China did with one-child policy, they did it in a shorter time. So once women are empowered, go to school and have control over how many kids they have, then the population start to decline. It's a function of economic growth and empowerment and economics. So it's there, but whether we, and the decline is real. India's population is going below replacement level. China is well below that, and the entire West, Japan. So, but other parts of the world are increasing. So whether we can bring together the technology, the decline that comes with the economic empowerment, all that in time to save this wild nature is a big question mark. But I think these are deep questions we have to think and not give casual answers in terms of that 17-year-old kid from Sweden does, all sorts of ridiculous ideas. So one other thing that I think is very interesting is tourism has become a force. It's an economic force. We are right now trashing parks, but if we can make the tourist money flow, it's 2 lakh per room in some resort in Ranthambore. If that can go to the farmer's hand, I'm sure many of the agricultural lands will switch to wildlife. This has happened in other countries. So we need all those innovations, new thinking, technology, learning from the past, but not wanting to take time travel back there. I think there is hope, because when I was a schoolboy, tigers were almost gone. There were less than 50 or 60 or maybe 70 in the entire Malnad. There are 350. There are 4 times more people. Their average wage is 30 times more. It was 2 rupees a man's day's wage in Puttur. So I'm an optimist. I think if we balance development the right way, decouple it from extracting nature, use the land sensibly, keeping nature and development apart rather than doing both on the same, I think there is scope. I think there is hope for tigers. And I am an eternal optimist. I've written about all this stuff in many books, etc., which are there. Sorry, I think I overran my time a little bit. With that, I will close, and I'm open to questions.
Greetings, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you. And I have 3 questions. The first one, if you could kindly throw light on how does that figure of 15 deer for a tiger, let us say in a year, how does that 15 translate to 500? You said in your talk, during the talk, that to have that interest of 15, you need the principle of 500.
If there are 500 prey animals, they have certain reproduction rate. So if the tiger crops about 10%, diet studies show that tiger, leopard, whatever, they are taking about 10%. So if you have a 500 base population, the cropping without depleting the prey will be at about 10% of that. So that's how the 50 comes, which they eat at 1 week's intervals.
So, and 2 more questions are from the inaugural part of your talk, though it's not directly related to the theme of the talk, but you said even harvesting wildlife can be considered conservation. But in the definition of wildlife, just before that, you said that it has to be free-ranging. But harvesting cannot obviously be free-ranging, to my understanding. Then how is this dichotomy?
No, it's not. I think it's terms. See, free-ranging means wild. That's what it means. It's living in the wild. So there are wild species that are hunted and harvested. Fisheries is a very good example. But even mammals are hunted and eaten in many, many countries. So I'm not saying it's appropriate right now for India, but I am saying it comes within the definition of scientific wildlife conservation.
Sir, and this again regarding the first slide itself, that these definitions and all are made by us only, by humans, like for wildlife. So why leave the poor invertebrates out? Because they're also a very important part of the complete cycle, pollination, and as you said. So why exclude out the invertebrates?
No, absolutely. See, the term biodiversity, that defines all that. See, biodiversity means all living creatures. That includes insects, that includes plants, everything. There's a definition for that. but this definition is misapplied. This definition, wildlife, the profession was created by Aldo Leopold. At that time, it was an offshoot of ecology. It's an applied field offshoot of ecology. So they defined as wildlife terrestrial, for one thing. They didn't put marine. So typically, if you go US schools and all, you have wildlife and fisheries department. So the marine stuff is taken out, but terrestrial fish are there because they are vertebrates, or frogs are there. Insects are left out, unfortunately, but it's just a definition.
Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. You mentioned that some 4% of forest land in India is conserved, I think. A couple years ago, I feel maybe around 2021 or 2022, these countries met in Montreal in UN's COP15, Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15. And they signed up an agreement and said by 2030, let's save 30% of our land and water for nature by 2030. Now, you said the number is 4% right now. 2030 is literally 6 years away. I think India is a party that signed this agreement. Do you feel there have been actions that the government, federal government, or the state governments in different parts are taking towards it? Do you feel there is an international pressure? And from every aspect, whether it's philanthropists or nonprofits or even corporations, do you feel everyone can participate in a way that this goal, which seems very unlikely, can actually be achieved?
I think the numbers are, the total land area, of the total land area, about 18 to 20% is under legally classified forests. They are under the jurisdiction of the forest department and they are considered forest. But a lot of them have been, with those impacts, have been deforested and don't have the structure and nature of a forest. If you look at all land in India that somewhat resembles the original forest, it's probably 10%, not 4%. But if you look where not just the trees, but also the wildlife is there, which are designated as wildlife, that is 4%. So the percentage is that. I think these conventions and international treaties, I'm not a specialist in them, but I think they are intentions. I don't think anybody can pressurize anybody to implement them, but the biggest driver of increasing that cover, land cover where wildlife can live, is what I argued for, is concentrating urbanization, efficient agriculture, so we reduce our human imprint on the land. So there is scope for vegetation and wildlife to come back. It could be through changing crop patterns from other crops to having wildlife and making money from wildlife, or it could be simply that agricultural areas which are now marginally farmed are abandoned and wildlife come back. And it could be just by reducing our livestock load where the vegetation is being suppressed by livestock, so it can come back. So there are many ways it can happen, but I think the primary driver, at least in these lands outside this 10%, has to be economics, the land use change. For example, we have 3,000, 4,000 square kilometers of coffee in the Western Ghats. Now it could have gone a different way. It was all forest. It could have been completely cleared, something else could have happened. At least with coffee, you have a crop which supports some biodiversity. So this kind of land use changes are mainly driven by economics rather than bureaucratic diktats. So to me, it's how we use agriculture, energy, efficiency, and economic drivers to spare more land. Many countries have vastly more land than us under forest. We are in a terrible position because we have a huge population and a small land area. We are 1/3 the size of China. We have the same population.
Just curious about that figure of 15 cubs per tigress.
Yeah.
How many of them survive?
Okay, the 15 cubs happens this way. The tigresses that breed are the only ones with territories, which have grown up to about 3-4 years age, are strong enough to fend or evict either their mother or some other old lady and occupy her territory, and able to defend it for the next 8 to 10 years from others taking over the territory. These are called resident females. They start breeding at the age of 3 or 4. And if they have cubs with them, they don't breed for the next 2.5, 3 years, because they have to raise these cubs, train these cubs to hunt, and once the cubs are 2.5, 3 years, they push the cubs out, and then they breed again. So let's say she has a tenure of 8 years and she has the 3 or 4 litters. That's how I come with that number of 15. A litter of 4 liters, 4 cubs per litter for 4 liters, something like that.
No, I follow that, Ullas. But how many do?
Oh, okay, survival.
How many survive?
Yeah. See, of all tigers, we have done some modeling on this. Of all tigers born, in the first year, they have about 30 to 40% mortality, the cubs. This happens because the mother has to hunt and bring food for them. She may not be able to do that, so not all cubs may survive. It brings the rate down. For example, in Russia, of all the tigers we have tracked, my colleagues have tracked, nobody has raised 3-4 cubs. They're all 1 or 2 cubs. But here in productive areas like Nagarhole and all, you see them raising 4 cubs to adulthood. One is that. The other thing is, when the dominant males also compete for mating rights, in a sense, for the male territories which give them priority mating rights. So when that happens, they go around killing all the cubs that are there. I mean, this is true in langur monkeys, cats, many species have this behavior so that their genes are propagated. So all these factors make that the first year, there's a very heavy losses. First to second year till they leave, they are bigger, they are able to defend. They are not fully qualified, competent hunters, but they share mother skills and they do, that period is better. But at 2, they disperse. That's when they suffer very heavy losses. Again, 50%, 30% are lost in the first year. So it's a rough world out for them. So the high reproduction kind of replenishes that.
Yeah. Hello. Do you think a change in our diet? Sorry. Do you think in a change in our diet, like veganism or something, can it have a big impact on the environment?
No, technically, not just veganism, any plant-based diet, the energetics involved in producing plants is lower than producing animals. The hydrocarbons or inputs or whatever, because animals are one step higher up in the food chain. In general, that's true. But diets are notoriously difficult to change, and people have certain patterns of eating. So, and some of the protein, animal protein that is eaten, may not necessarily come from crops. They may come from other kinds of plants, in which case it won't make such a difference. But where we are feeding corn and agriculturally grown crops in massive ways to raise livestock, then definitely a vegetarian's footprint on wild nature is less than that of a meat eater. But this is true of extreme carnivory. For the most part, at least in our culture, meat is eaten as a supplement rather than all meat diets, which are different. And there are 2 approaches now. One is bacterial fermentation, one is cellular multiplication of producing plant-based meat. There are those experiments going on and they're catching up in some places, but still it boils down to energy. The energy required to produce plant-based meats is more than raising livestock in most cases. So it's again boils down, if you make energy cheap, a lot of these things can happen.
Hi, I have a question around the tiger census. So now, given that we use a lot of trap cameras to count the numbers, and it's much more accurate, the 2022 census had a number of about 3,200 tigers around the country, as opposed to about 2,900 in 2018. While some states, for example, Madhya Pradesh, the number shot up from about 520 to close to about 750 in just that span of 4 years. What's your commentary on about how accurate those numbers, especially in certain local areas, are as opposed to the overall country? Thank you.
No, all these numbers to me are meaningless. In the sense, the methodology employed is so weak and so poor because of institutional issues, because of technical issues. The numbers don't, for example, you are talking about these parks, intensively monitored parks. Okay, there's two kinds of monitoring goes on, using cameras or whatever. And the other one, which is an extrapolation from these to wider landscapes. So I'll come to the first one. The camera traps are used, but their camera traps have very restrictive conditions. See, the population is changing through birth, deaths, immigration. It's not a constant. So you have to take a snapshot to get a number. This trapping period has to be very short, so you have a number that you can expect hasn't changed while you are counting. Unfortunately, that is called a closed model capture-recapture. So you do it within a short period and you get a total count for that area for that period, density or whatever. But if you keep the cameras on for months on end, which is a common practice, and if you don't keep two cameras, because the left and right flanks are different, if you count multiple flanks as different animals, or if you start mixing up data from previous years and recycle photographs like they used to recycle pug marks, then the whole basis for doing this thing goes away. The other point is, given these survival rates of 25% losses per year, if you do your surveys once in 4 years, you are virtually losing all the data. So I do not set anything in store by these numbers, because I have data for the same years, and 1 year they have actually used our data. The other big problem is the extrapolation. The extrapolation is used some kind of a regression model. It simply doesn't work. And the problem with that is better methods exist, but the better methods, this method can be tailored to generate numbers in some sense. And we have shown that, I mean, this is deep statistics, we have shown with their own data that that's what is happening. Because these extrapolations, if you remember the history of tiger counting, the Pugmark census said there were 1,800. Let's say 2,000 tigers in 1969 when the first survey was done. That was taken as a base figure, 2,000 tigers. And then it kept on going up. And by 2002, the last time the Pugmark census was done, 2002, it had gone to 3,600, the number. Then there was all this tiger task force, and they said abandon the Pugmark, use cameras, but that was all. That was arm waving. The tiger task force didn't have any tiger expertise, and they let it loose, do what you want, essentially. And what the system did was, we have changed the method. There are only 1,400 tigers in India. So the 2006 census says there are 1,400 tigers. Now it gives you room to play game with these numbers for the next 10 years. By then, 3 people would have retired. So I do not trust these numbers. And we have insisted that the numbers are collected at taxpayers' expense. They're held in Delhi. They're not shared with anybody. Only the results are shared. If you lay out all the details of this outcome, it can be shown. But if you don't release the details, you hold it like some state secret, then so I just keep saying do better things, and the methodology change hasn't made a difference, except that it costs hundreds of times more than the Pugmark census. Still the data is not available. At least with the Pugmark census, they would distribute the tracings. That's how I tested and found it didn't work. I don't have that. In a sense, I haven't done the extrapolation countrywide, but my big picture view is there could be 3,000 to 4,000 tigers. And what does 3,000 mean? Let us say, if there were 2,000 in 1970, and there were about 3,000 by now, it's an increase rate of 1% per year compounded. It's no great shakes. It's better than any other country, I agree. But it's nothing to crow about. But this jacking up and down, then you don't get the value. But more interesting question to me is how many tigers can we have? That we can answer. We have 400,000 square kilometers of forest, 4 lakh square kilometers of forest, which are under the forest department where tigers can live. Of which some of these prime areas like Kana, Nagarhole, the better places are now over time they have recovered, and they do support tigers at densities, sometimes even excess of natural. I would say without any modifications, you can have five tigers per 100 square kilometers in this entire 400,000. So we have a potential to have 10 to 15,000 tigers easily. Instead of setting a goal, measuring accurately and saying where we are going, we are building stories around the tiger rather than, so my argument is we can easily have 10 and perhaps 15,000 tigers with the land base we have, without expanding outside.
Dr. Gadgil mentions in his recent book about a number of studies he had conducted in North Kanara district and perhaps Maharashtra, memory fails me, that rural-based communities had had some sort of control over, foray into the forests and, destruction. He puts most of the blame on the forest department, which came up with, timber, which was more economically beneficial to the government or maybe the private companies also. What is your view on this? Could it have survived in the old system that we had?
I am aware of his arguments. What has replaced the forest? That's the question. Agriculture has replaced the forest. This is not just in India, this is a global phenomena. As numbers increase, people want more land to farm. So what the British did in 1900s, there's a very good study by Mr. Shamsundar and Mr. Parmeshwarappa, a book called, which documents it nicely, but it's available data, that in the 1850s, there was probably twice as much forest as we have now. Large part of India was forested, but it was getting deforested very rapidly because the population was increasing. There was stability in the country, population started shooting up, and both shifting cultivation, kumri, as well as permanent agriculture were expanding. And the British, this was after, just before the revolt, Sepoy Mutiny, first freedom struggle, whatever. There was a lot of debate between 1830 and 1816 within the British government, with the military saying that our navy will be powerless if we allow forests to vanish at this rate. So we have to carve out a government forest estate where you cannot farm. You cannot convert it to a farm. So there was the other side, the revenue people who had just dealt with the Sepoy Mutiny and all said, let's not disturb the local people, let them do what they want. But in the end, they weighed in favor of creating the Forest Service. At that time, there was a famous ecologist called, he was a doctor, but he was a fantastic ecologist called Cleghorn and others, argued that for ecological security, we must have this area. Paul Walker he said 1/3 should be under forest. So that argument led to the creation of reserve forest. But unfortunately, it was biased in favor of high quality timber forests. If you look at Karnataka, it's along the Western Ghats that we had high proportion of the land under reserve forest. The plains, it was 5%, 10%, because those were not valuable forests. So, but they were deciduous forests all the way, except in Kurnool and some places. We had deciduous forest is the natural vegetation all over Karnataka. So, but if you look at it today, without getting into that finer detail, if the argument was true that local communities had protected all those forests and the British reserved areas were actually damaging the forest, these other hinterlands in Karnataka should have been teeming with deciduous forest. What happened to those forests? They just vanished. So, at another level, when you look at the management of forests under the British regime, it was meant as commercial forestry. It was meant for earning revenues to the government. But when they reserved, they kept as much forest outside for local use by communities. These were called Kumkis in South Canara, Betta in Uttara Kannada. They had all sorts of tenure where the local people had control. So by the 1980s, it is true that the forest department has damaged the original reserve forest significantly. I am not denying that. That's why I am arguing for protected areas where you don't have this. But the forests that were left under village communities by the British, they have also vanished. Each arecanut or paddy cultivator in Uttara Kannada was given 9 acres of betta land to sustainably manage and manage his paddy or areca or whatever. Most of them are gone and denuded. Gadgil himself had a huge project to bring the vegetation back. Nothing came back. So, I think these are romantic ideas. I don't think they are rooted in rural realities of how people use wood and how we are not a wise species generally. So, some regulation is required. But at the same time, if you go to Northeast India or somewhere where the central government has no role, no social power, there's no point creating a massive forest department which can't do anything. So somebody has to exercise the power. This is my view. I think some element of coercion is necessary. It can't all be free for all. But that element of coercion, who should exercise? It could be a Naga Tribal Council but it could be a forest department here. It could be a company that actually owns the plantation. So these are questions of power. So I generally don't agree with the argument that left to themselves, people will wisely manage forests. Thank you all.
Yeah. On behalf of BIC, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Karanth for conceiving this fabulous masterclass, putting it all together, getting the experts to BIC, and then actually having the commitment to carry it out and end it in this fabulous way today. Dr. Karanth, our deepest gratitude. Thank you so much.